Hey, how's it going, everyone? Today we are going to be looking at error boundaries, how to use them, what they are, and how you can test them as well. So we got this very beautiful Create React app that is as vanilla as they come. And what we're going to do is trigger an error and then figure out how we can catch it. So we're coming into our app here, and let's say that we've got an error in our render function. So we've got a null just to ensure that there's an error, and we're going to map a null, which does not work, and we will see a big error appear on the screen. Cannot read property map of null, which is what we expected. And in development mode, it gives you this nice big error, but let's go see what happens on production. So we'll just build this quickly, and once we're done building, we'll deploy it to Netlify so we can see it out on the web. This shouldn't take long. Cool. Netlify deploy. And once it's out there, we'll visit it and we'll see the white screen of death, or blank screen of death. Basically, an error occurred. We didn't handle it because we haven't added our error boundary yet. And we come down here and we see that cannot read property map of null. So we are getting the error in the console, but what's the user to think? That all they're seeing is a white screen. They don't know what's happening. They're going to refresh a bunch of times probably. So let's fix that situation. Okay, so normally when you're trying to catch errors, you wrap it in a try catch, right? And that's exactly what error boundaries are, but they're basically a try catch for your components. So for like the render function, for the component did mount, all of that stuff. If an error occurs anywhere down the component tree, you want to catch it and then render a nicer error message that an error has occurred in your app. Sorry, we're aware, and all that stuff. So let's implement our error boundary. We're going to do that by first creating a folder, error boundary, and we're going to just add an index.js. And what I like to do is just import it from a file with the same name as the folder and then export that as default. The reason I like doing this is a place where I can sort of, if I need to enhance this component at all, either by maybe like injecting MobX or connecting it to Redux, I can do this here instead of in the component file itself. It lets me separate them to make it easier to test without testing within the context of the connected or injected component version. So we come here and we create our error boundary .jsx. So all an error boundary is a component that implements a specific lifecycle function. So let's get our component set up first. So we want to import React, oh boy, from React, and then we'll import prop types from prop types. And now we want to export a default class, so our component. So we'll export default class error boundary, which extends react.component, and it implements the render function. So we'll leave this blank for now, but we'll come back to it. So this is not an error boundary yet, despite its lovely name of error boundary. To make it a true error boundary, we need to implement the component did catch lifecycle function. And this is a function which receives two things: an error and some additional sort of contextual information about that error. And this is essentially our catch. So the whole thing is like in a try, and this little thing here is our catch. So let's say that when we catch, we want to store that somewhere so that we can render a nice error message below that an error has occurred, we've caught it, and we're aware of it. So let's come up with some state first. So we've got some state, and we'll have three properties. Has error, which is false at the beginning, the error, which is null, and the error info, which is also null. Okay, so we've got our state here, and let's now update our state with the error message. So we use setState, and we'll say that hasError is now true, and then we'll put the error and the error info into our state as well. So now that we've got our state, we've caught our error, and we've updated our state with this information, now we can render something different if hasError is true. So we'll put a little if statement here, and if state.hasError is true, what we can do instead is return some sort of error message that will be displayed to our user. So we'll do a div with a class of error, and oops, error occurred. We'll just close out our div here. All right, so if an error occurs, this is what we want to render to the screen. So what if there is no error? In this case, we're going to return this.props.children. Okay, so what are these children that we're returning if there's no error? So that all has to do with when you use this error boundary, because up until this point, we've declared an error boundary component class, but we've never used it yet. So where do you use an error boundary? Typically, you want to use it sort of as high up in your component tree as possible, because when an error occurs, it gets bubbled up, and it will keep getting bubbled up until it encounters its first error boundary. So you can use error boundary in multiple places in your app, sort of maybe for various larger sections like a chat widget or notifications or whatnot. But you typically also want to have one at the top level just to make sure that you're catching all errors that might occur within your component tree. So in Create React App, we're going to stick it right here in this index file around our app component, which sort of signifies the entire application. So let's import it first. Import error boundary from error boundary, and then wrap that around our app. Cool. So now if we go back here, it's still displaying the error, but let's refresh. It would help if we were running the app, no? So we start it, refresh, and what you're going to see is for a split second. All right, let's fix this first. Error boundary is not defined in src index. Okay, that's because we're outside of here and we're going into error boundary. Did I spell something wrong? Error boundary. Import error bound. Oh, jeez. Import error boundary, not boundary error, from error boundary. Everyone is probably yelling at the screen, no? All right. So if I refresh it, you're going to see for a split second, oops, error occurred, and then it gets replaced with this React error screen. So in development mode, React wants to, in bright colors, display you this error so that you can fix your null.map. But in production, what will just happen is it will show you that error message, and it obviously won't display the details of your error to the user. So let's just test that quickly. We'll build again, and then we'll deploy it as soon as it's done building. All right, and then we'll do a netlify deploy. It's pretty quick, so we load this up, and oops, error occurred. So it's still going to log to the console, but this time we don't have that white or clear screen of death. We've got our beautifully styled oops, error occurred message. So it's a much better user experience. They know that an error occurred, and you could let them know that you're aware of it and whatnot. And I'll show you how you can be aware of it in a second. So let's go back here and we'll start our React app again. And we're just going to work on improving our error boundary for now. So it's working, it's catching the error, it's displaying the error message, but I think we can improve it. So what we're going to do is use and define some prop types. So we've got static prop types, and you'll see that we're using children, which was in our case here, app. So app arrives as, because it's a child of error boundary in the props.children. So let's just validate that we were given children correctly. So what it's going to be is one of type, and you give that an array, and this is required. And what is it a type of? It's a type of a node, or it's an array of nodes. So it's either one node or an array of node, and a node represents like a component basically, and a DOM node or an element. So same thing here, but now we're at least validating that we're receiving the correct props. So the next thing I think we can do to improve it is maybe you do want to use this error boundary in multiple places in your app, and you want the error to either have different text or be styled slightly differently. To do that, we can actually pass in a render prop so that it will use that instead of this hard-coded return right here. So up here, we will define our render prop, and what we're going to say is that it's a function and it is required. So we'll go back and we'll pass it first. So we pass our render prop, which is a function. And this function will return. So we'll just arrow function here to return. In this case, let's just make it a P that says oops. So that's what we want to show to the user when an error occurs. So we come back to our error boundary, and now we want to use that, our render prop, instead of this div here. So all we simply do is we return this.props.render, and it's a function, so we call it. And if we wanted to, we could pass the error and the error info to this render prop, so that if it wanted to, it could maybe display some information about that error that's occurred. So that would be where you come back here and you can receive the error that was passed to it. So let's just make sure it's still working. For like the split second, there we go. We see oops, which is that P that was now passed as a render prop. All right, so our error boundary is looking pretty good. We've defined prop types. We've got our state to track the error when it gets caught. We're rendering correctly when there's an error using our render prop. Else, we're just showing the children, which is our app component. But let's say we want to notify our error tracker that it's occurred. We've already displayed a nice message to the user, but now we need to know that this has happened. So what we can do is, in FlipGive where I work, we use an error tracker called Bugsnag, and it is available on the window object sort of globally. So we can just check if that's available. So if window.bugsnag, we can notify Bugsnag about the error, so that it will get sent to our error tracker, and we can fix it so that the user doesn't have to deal with this error going forward. Cool, so it's still working well. Let's just go inside here and we'll remove this error that we're triggering in our app so that things are back to normal. And now let's look at how we might test this error boundary. So because we've set it up this way in this error boundary folder, we'll come in here and we'll add a test for it. So .test.jsx. And in our test, we want to import the error boundary from a file with the same name. And then we can say that it catches error and displays message. And then we'll do our little arrow function here where we write the code for that. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is basically use our component or render it or mount it sort of thing. So I'm using enzyme here, and I'm going to use a function called mount. And I'll just write it and then I'll explain how I can use it globally. So we're going to say const wrapper is equal to, we're going to mount our error boundary and error boundary there. So remember that you must pass a render prop to it. So we'll pass it a render prop and we'll say that it, in this case, let's just have it do a span tag that says, Go. So this is what will be rendered if an error occurs. But remember our other prop type, we also have to pass children to it. So let's just define like a fake sort of child component. So we'll say child, const child equals an arrow function. And what we're going to do is let's just trigger an error, because that's what we're doing. We're trying to make sure that it works correctly, catches errors. So we'll throw an error. So as soon as you use this thing, it will throw an error immediately. So we've got our child inside of our error boundary so that it should catch it. So what is mount? Where did it come from? Mount comes from enzyme, and I've set it up globally so I don't have to import it here in our setup tests file inside of source. So here you can see that global.mount is equal to mount, which comes from enzyme. So if you haven't done much testing in React, I've got a video on that in my YouTube channel on sort of basic testing within React, and it talks about enzyme, Jest, which is the testing runner engine that we're using, and it also talks about sign-on, which is a sort of spy and mocking functionality. So we're going to use mount to mount our error boundary, and we've got it inside of this wrapper variable now. So next we want to basically extract the text from this rendered or mounted component so that we can make sure that it's equal to in this case. So we'll put that in a variable and we'll say wrapper, get me the text. And then we can say that we expect the text to equal like that. Done. So let's come down and run our test to make sure that it's working. So we exit out of there and we do a yarn test. And what we'll see is that we have, we'll just run all the tests. There we go. So it says it's passed, so that means it's working. And we can ensure that. We'll put a couple extra exclamation marks. So it's telling us now it wanted 3, but it got 1. So it is working correctly. But what you'll see is that you've got this big ugly console.error occurring. And that's because React in sort of anything other than production mode, whenever it encounters an error that's caught by an error boundary, it wants to log to the console.error, which is great normally, because normally you want to be aware if an error has occurred that you weren't expecting. But in this case, it's a little bit annoying because we do want an error to occur, because that is exactly what we're testing. So let's basically see how we can swallow this error to just make it not occur during the life of this test, but have it work fine elsewhere. I'm going to create a little helper function. It's a little bit hacky, I would say. And there is an issue open in the React repository to fix this when people want to test error boundaries and not get a big console.error. But for now, we can swallow it so that it doesn't throw this big red message in our lovely green tests. So we're going to create a little function called swallow errors. And what it will do, it's an arrow function that will receive a function that we'll call code to run. So inside here, we're going to access console.error and basically take this value, which is a function, put it into a variable. And the reason we're doing that is so we're not going to lose this function and we can reapply it a little bit later. So then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, console.error is now equal to an arrow function that does nothing. So whenever you call console.error, nothing will occur. Then we want to run the code to run. And then we'll sort of bring back the correct console.error function that we had removed. So now whenever you wrap this function around some code, you will not see console.error on the screen, which is nice for us down here. So we'll just take this code here and we'll say we want to swallow errors, and it receives a function which is the code to run, and we'll move all of this code to run inside swallow errors. So now we run it and we get all green. So run it again, still all green. It's working, there's no errors, and we're very happy. So let's just review what we've covered in this video. We've looked at error boundaries. What they do is they catch errors that occur within the component tree lower. So any children of the error boundary component. And if an error occurs during rendering or component did mount or any of those lifecycle functions, React's basically like, I don't know how to render because an error occurred. So instead of rendering garbage, I'm going to render nothing, which is what we saw originally, the blank screen of death. But what we can do is catch that error so that we can render an error message to the user, and if we want to, we can notify our error tracking service. So we did that by implementing the component did catch lifecycle function, which is given an error and some additional error info, contextual information about the error that occurred. We'll put that in state, so we'll say that there is an error now. Here's the error and its info. And now that that's in the state, our render function can either render the render prop, provided by whoever's using this error boundary component, or if there's no error, simply render the children, which is what we want to happen. So we use this at the top level. So error boundary, we provided our render prop, which simply displayed a P that said oops. And we provided the children, which in this case was our app. So we want to make sure that it's working correctly. So we came over here and we mounted our error boundary, and we gave it a child that will always throw an error. And we gave it our render prop here of uh-oh. So after we did that, because an error occurred in child, we should be able to grab the text, and if it's working correctly, it should say uh-oh because it caught the error. And it was. But it was console.erroring that message to the screen that we wanted to swallow in the case of this test. So we wrapped our code in this swallow errors function, which sort of basically turned off console.error, ran the code, then turned it back on. And that's it for today. That's how you can use error boundaries to catch errors and display nice error messages to your users so that they know what's going on and that you've been made aware of the error. Hope you enjoyed the video, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.